Welcome to Research Methodologies. This is Module 3 in a series prepared for students doing doctoral degrees. And in this module we will be looking at research design and data collection. In this module what we will be doing is we'll be looking at a number of areas, including forming our research design or our research model. What does this mean? How do we go about it? We'll also be looking at various research methodologies. There's more than one way of going about doing your research, and we will look at that also. We'll also examine how we go about collecting and examining our data, and also some of the commonly used techniques for gathering data and looking at what is most appropriate for your research project. What is research design, and what is a research model? Well, it has been defined as a master plan, and it's probably the best way to look at it. It is a plan of what we are going to examine and how we are going to examine it and why we are going to examine particular areas within our research which make up our design or our plan. It specifies the methods and procedures for collecting and for analysing the needed information. A master plan, like any plan, has got to be specific. If we're building a house, for example, our plan must be very specific about what the ultimate design is going to look like and the processes and procedures we need to go through to build our building. And it's the same with a research design or with a research master plan. We've got to understand specifically and explain in detail, logically and clearly, how we're going to go about doing our research. So our research design should be able to clearly specify and describe, firstly, the variables involved in the study that need to be examined for a causal relationship. Does training cause or have some effect upon the effective handling of customer complaints, for example? They are two variables, training and handling of customer complaints. Our research design will also describe the method we're going to use to collect the data that is going to provide us with the information to determine whether there is a relationship between these variables. And you remember before we talked about operationalising the concept, which means that when we're talking, for example, about training, what do we mean by training? Different forms of training: formal training, informal training, training that's done in the workplace, training that's done outside of the workplace. Is there a difference between education and training? We need to understand these concepts so that we know what we are going to measure. And if we know what we're going to measure, we know then what sort of data we need to collect to provide these measurements. Now, continuing to use our example of our customer complaints, let's have a look at what this means in relationship to our research design or our model. Now, let us presume that the three variables that we are going to look at in relation to the handling of customer complaints and the variables that relate to customer complaints, we will say are training, product quality and after-sales service. Now, how did we come up with those variables? Now, for our example's sake, we have assumed that previous studies that we have done through our literature review seem to indicate that these factors are important in relation to customer service. Or it may be that we have developed some new ones that we are going to test. So our three variables are training, product quality and after-sales service. And we are going to see how that relates to the effective or ineffective handling of customer complaints. So this is our model, this is our basic model. Now, in putting this information into a diagram form, we see here that we have our variables, and you'll notice that we have two different sorts of variables. We have independent variables and dependent variables. Dependent variable, in this case, customer complaints resolution, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, is the variable that we are examining. And the independent variables, training, product quality, and after-sales service, are the variables which influence, which we believe could influence customer complaints resolution. Now, in our research, we can look at all three variables and see how they affect the dependent variable. We can see how strong one variable is to the other. In other words, with independent variables, we can see perhaps which of those variables has the strongest influence on customer complaints. And if we wish, we can even drop one of the variables and perhaps look at two variables in relation to the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the one that doesn't change, but with the independent variables, we can manipulate those to either perhaps drop one or perhaps even add one if we wish. We might find through our research, for example, that although these three independent variables may be important, we might discover that there are other independent variables which are important to customer complaints resolution. The independent variables we can manipulate, change and play with. The dependent variable is the one that we are seeking to examine. There are various research methodologies that we can use in doing our research. Commonly we think of the quantitative one, the quantitative research, which is more scientific and objective by nature. And with quantitative research, we are collecting data that we can measure statistically. And in quantitative research, we are normally fairly sure about the variables in which we want to examine. And those and the examination we do is in terms of numbers, in terms of statistics. However, there are other forms of research methodologies, and the other broad one is what we call qualitative research. Now, this isn't objective research, it isn't scientific research like the quantitative method. It is more subjective in nature, and is often used to try and find out more in terms of a preliminary study to understand variables that may be involved in a particular situation. It may be that in a particular work situation, in a particular business situation, we know that there is an area which we wish to examine, but we may not be sure just what variables, what factors influence a particular situation. So a qualitative research may be done to try and understand more clearly what is going on, what variables are involved, so that out of that study we can do a more rigorous and more conclusive study in the future. The sort of qualitative or exploratory research that is often undertaken includes experience surveys. In other words, people involved perhaps in a particular business situation or a particular business context are surveyed and are provided with a series of questions. And out of their experience, the researcher tries to make sense of what's going on and to isolate particular variables which might be common to the people involved in that situation. And out of this sort of research, then further research can be done, taking those variables and then perhaps using the quantitative method to understand more clearly the cause and effect relationship. Qualitative research normally is not about trying to find a cause and effect situation, it's just trying to explore and make sense of what is going on in a particular situation and to understand the variables which might be involved. Secondary data analysis is also another qualitative way of trying to make sense of the situation, taking perhaps a mass of information and statistics and trying to find some sort of pattern to them. A very common form of qualitative research is the case study, looking perhaps at a company or a number of companies and trying to understand what is happening, what sort of factors are involved in a particular situation in a company at a particular time. And these are common forms of qualitative research, which are very, very important, and students that are thinking about research topics are not discouraged from undertaking this type of research. There is a school of thought in the area of research that challenges even the quantitative method of research. The quantitative method of research comes out of the scientific community, and there are researchers that say that examining human beings, and that's what we are doing when we are doing business research, examining human beings is different to examining chemicals or rocks or non-living matter. Chemicals and rocks and non-living matter are often subjected to very, very specific and understandable laws of nature. But human beings are different. Human beings are very changeable. Human beings react differently in different environments. The tastes and habits of human beings change from moment to moment. They change as we grow and develop and as we move into different situations. So qualitative research, according to some researchers, is a more valid method of doing research than even quantitative. This is something for you as a researcher which is open for you to explore and examine, but we do not discourage researchers undertaking qualitative research in the context of business. There is some very, very valuable work to be done in this particular area, which will provide us with new insights and new knowledge into business environments and situations. Having operationalised our concepts, having defined what our variables mean, having decided how we're going to, what sort of information we need to gather, we then need to collect that information. So we need to know who we are going to collect the information from. Where are we going to collect the information from? Now, in many cases, it's impossible for us to perhaps gather all the data we need from all the possible sources. For example, if we were going to examine customer complaints in the airline industry in Malaysia, it would be impossible for us to talk to or to survey or to collect data from every person who complained to the airlines. It would be impossible for us to collect that information from every airline in Malaysia. So what we need to do is we need to choose a sample of the total population of people who complain, of people who handle complaints, and of airline industries. We need to restrict the number of people that we actually are going to collect information from. Having decided what our sample group is, and we can decide our sample group by various methods, we then decide what method of data collection are we going to use. Are we going to interview people? Are we going to ask them questions? Are we going to interview them face to face? Are we going to provide questionnaires? How are we going to provide the questionnaires? We're going to mail them to people, we're going to phone them, Are we going to do it face-to-face? Are we going to do it over the internet? We have a variety of ways of collecting this sort of information. Are we going to do surveys? Are we going to perhaps observe? Are we going to sit in a particular business environment and see what's going on? If we have the opportunity, are we going to observe what goes on when someone comes into a complaints department and makes a complaint? Are we going to be able to see and listen to the sort of complaint and see and listen to the way in which the complaint is handled? There are a variety of ways of collecting data, and which one we use will be the one which is appropriate for our research and the sort of data that we need to collect. Of course, we may also use a variety of means. It doesn't mean that we have to just use one or the other. We might use a variety of means of collecting data. And of course, this will all enrich the information that we get and will provide us with a greater insight into the area that we're examining. In collecting our data, we've got to be very, very careful about the way we go about doing it. It's not just a matter of running out and conducting surveys and questionnaires, issuing questionnaires. We've got to make sure that the information that we get is both reliable and valid. In other words, our research findings have got to be credible. And credible means that they've got to be believable. And that a lot of that will have to do with the way, the method, the means we go about collecting our data. So let's now look at what we mean by reliability and validity and give some examples of how different factors may influence the results of the data that we collect. Reliability has something to do with, will the results that we get from our research, will they be similar if we go about and do the research again? In other words, if we repeat the research, are we going to get similar outcomes? Also, if other researchers, having read our research, go out and do a similar study, will they get similar outcomes? And what are some things which may influence the reliability of our data? The two areas are in relation to the subjects of our research, the people who are involved in our research, and also the person that is doing the research. So we talk about subject and participant error and bias, and also we talk about the observer error and bias. The subjects are the people whom we are examining. The observer is the one who is doing the research. So we may have errors in both areas. We've given some examples here of subject or participant error. For example, we might find that people's enthusiasm for what they are doing may be different at different times of the week. We might find, for example, that people work differently, perhaps on a Wednesday, midway through the week, than they do perhaps on a Monday when they've just got back from the weekend and they're just getting back into their job, or on a Friday when they're winding up, getting ready for the weekend. So the level of enthusiasm might be quite different. So if we survey someone on a Monday or a Friday, we might find that the result would be different if we conducted the same sort of survey or collected the same sort of information perhaps on Wednesday. So there we might have, unbeknownst to us, subject and participant error. These are the things as researchers we've got to think through. We might also have bias, subject and participant bias. And this may be that people who are involved in our research may have a particular fear about the the sort of information they give us. They might think, for example, that we're going to show their answers to questions perhaps to management. They might fear that what they say about their job and about the organisation they work for might get back to management, and it might have some effect on their work or the environment of their work. Also, peer pressure. People might answer questions thinking that the answers they provide are the sort of things that the people that they work with would like to hear. And this is so especially when the data that we collect is done within a group. And often people will answer not according to what they think, but according to what they think the group wants to hear. So this creates bias in our results. Not only is there error and bias with those from whom we are collecting data, but also there can be error and bias from the person who is actually conducting the research. There can be error in the way in which we gather our data. We might gather data from different groups of people in different ways. Error might come in. We might make errors in our additions or our sorting of data. Also, bias might come in perhaps the way that we interpret responses. These all affect the reliability of our research and may mean that our research, the data that we've collected and the results that we come up with are not as valid or not as reliable as they could be. So we must be careful about these particular biases and errors that can slip into our research. Let's now look at validity. Validity is similar in a sense to reliability. Does the findings that we report really reflect what was going on? Are they really valid? And we've got to be careful in a number of areas. For example, we talk about validity in the context of history. In other words, if we are collecting data at a particular time in the life of the company, it may have a big influence on the way people respond. We mentioned here as an example of perhaps a survey being done among employees asking their attitude towards their company and their job just after a lot of people have been dismissed from their job. Other examples might be that perhaps a company hasn't paid a bonus in a particular year, or the bonus hasn't been as large as what employees expected. Surveying them at that time would obviously influence perhaps the sort of responses we get to questions we ask employees about their job and about the company. Also, validity has to do with testing, and again it comes back to this area of people involved in our sampling and in our surveys being afraid of where that information, or how that information might be used. And many employees are often afraid to give true and accurate and open answers to questions because they think that those responses may be seen by their managers, and it may influence and may have some impact upon their job. Also, the instrumentation that we use. It may be that we're surveying a number of groups, and before we collect the data, we brief each group. We tell them what the research is about, what the data is about, why the data is important. Now, if different groups are briefed in different ways, that could also have an influence on the outcome of the data that we collect. Also, we talk here about mortality. And if our research is done over a long period of time, we might find that the people who were in the original batch of data that we collected are not there in the middle or at the end. If, for example, we were doing collecting data in a hospital situation. Hospitals are well known for quick, large turnovers of nursing staff. So we might find that the batch of nurses that we surveyed at the beginning of our study are not there during the term of our study. New people are coming in. So that may also have an effect on the validity of our findings, because we are not examining a consistent group. We are examining different people, different groups, with different understandings of what the data collection and research is all about, different times. And this takes us on to the area of maturity, that during a lengthy survey time, things will change. Things will change in the company, and we might find that this will have an impact on how valid our results are. And another important one with validity is not understanding the cause and effect. If, for example, we found that the motivation of sales staff was dropping, and we also found that the level of sales was dropping, we may possibly conclude that because the salespeople are less motivated, sales are dropping. That may be what we see as the causal relationship, the cause and effect. But that may not be the case at all. It may be that sales are dropping because the product is not popular anymore with consumers. It may be that the product that they're selling is out of date. It is not keeping up with latest technology. And as a result of the drop in sales staff are becoming less motivated. So we may misunderstand completely cause and effect relationship. This is something that we've got to examine very, very carefully to make sure that we are picking up what is causing another factor to occur. Having collected all of our data, we are then in a very important position of editing our data. We must make sure that our data, having collected our data, that we sort it and edit it and record it in a meaningful way. In a meaningful way so that we can analyse it statistically. We must make sure that the factors that are involved, the concepts that are involved, are very clearly understood and sorted and analysed after our data is collected. Now, the sorting and editing and recording of data is very important, because it's at this point that mistakes can be made. But the data must be put into a form that can then be meaningfully statistically analysed if we're doing quantitative research. Or if we're doing qualitative research, we must make sure that we get the information in a format that will enable us to logically and meaningfully discuss the information and to draw conclusions and to make recommendations. This now takes us to the end of this module, and in our next module we'll be looking at some various measures of statistical analysis. We'll be looking at the discussion of the results of our analysis of our data. We'll be looking at hypothesis testing. We'll be looking at answering our research questions, and we'll be looking at the area of making recommendations and also acknowledging limitations to our study. So we will see you in the next module.